On the morning of November 14, 1983, Margaret Holloway stood in front of her seventh-grade classroom at Lincoln Middle School in Falls Church, Virginia, holding a yellow attendance sheet that would later be locked inside a CIA vault with a classification level she would never be cleared to know. She had no idea that the pattern of absences she'd been tracking for 3 months had inadvertently mapped the operational schedule of a Soviet intelligence network operating barely 5 miles from the Pentagon. She thought she was simply doing her job. The men who would visit her 6 weeks later knew she had done something far more dangerous. Falls Church existed in the peculiar twilight of proximity to power. Close enough to Washington that defense contractors filled the office parks, and military officers lived in split-level homes with chain-link fences, yet far enough that people still believed they lived normal lives removed from the machinery of Cold War geopolitics. They were wrong. By 1983, the Washington metropolitan area contained more intelligence officers per square mile than any other location on Earth outside Moscow. The KGB's first chief directorate maintained at least 40 illegals in the region, officers operating under deep cover with fabricated American identities, some living their false lives for decades. The CIA's counterintelligence center knew this. What they didn't know was where most of them were, or what they were doing. The surveillance state was vast and sophisticated, but it had blind spots. Ordinary American life, with its mundane rhythms and banal routines, provided perfect camouflage. A Soviet intelligence officer could hide in plain sight by becoming the most unremarkable person imaginable. And their children, sent to public schools to maintain the illusion of normalcy, became part of that camouflage too. Margaret Holloway was 52 years old in the autumn of 1983, a woman whose entire adult life had been spent in classrooms that smelled of chalk dust and floor wax. She had never married, though there had been someone once, a young law student she'd met in 1954 who'd been drafted and sent to Korea and came back different in ways neither of them could articulate. They'd tried for a year after his return, but the silence between them had grown until it became the only thing they shared. She'd poured herself into teaching after that, finding in the chaos of adolescent minds a purpose that personal happiness had never provided. She was known as strict but fair, the kind of teacher students complained about during the year and thanked in letters a decade later. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Arlington, drove a 1976 Ford Pinto that burned oil, and spent her evenings grading papers while listening to public radio. She had voted for Carter, then reluctantly for Reagan when the hostage crisis had made her doubt everything she'd believed about diplomacy and strength. She considered herself apolitical, which was itself a political position she didn't recognize. She believed in education, in structure, in the small dignities of doing a job well even when no one was watching. Her classroom was on the second floor of Lincoln Middle School, a brick building erected in 1959 with the optimistic institutional architecture of the Eisenhower era. Wide hallways, large windows, spaces designed for a future that believed in progress and the perfectibility of society through proper planning. By 1983, that optimism had curdled. The windows didn't open properly anymore. The heating system clanged and hissed. The linoleum floors were scuffed beyond repair, marked with the passage of 24 years of children who'd grown into a world more complicated and frightening than their building suggested. Margaret's room overlooked the parking lot, and beyond it a stand of oak trees that turned gold each October. A small beauty she appreciated during the minutes between classes, when the room emptied and she could hear herself think. She taught American history to 4 different 7th-grade sections, each containing roughly 28 students, a demographic cross-section of Northern Virginia's strange mixture of working-class families, military transplants, and the children of people who worked in offices with no signs on the doors. Most were unremarkable in the way of 12- and 13-year-olds, struggling through the confusion of puberty and social hierarchy, while she tried to make them care about the Constitutional Convention and the Missouri Compromise. But every year, there were a few who stood out, and in the fall of 1983, one of those was a boy named Peter Novak. Peter had transferred to Lincoln in late August, appearing on her roster without the usual paperwork trail, His records indicated he'd previously attended schools in Pennsylvania and Ohio, following his father's work in pharmaceutical sales. He was quiet, almost eerily so, with dark hair and gray eyes that seemed older than 13. He sat in the back corner of her third-period class and took notes in a handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. He never volunteered answers, but when called upon demonstrated a knowledge of American history that went beyond the textbook, offering details about Lend-Lease and the Yalta Conference that made her wonder if he'd been studying from college materials. His essays were flawless in grammar, but strangely cold, as if written by someone mimicking human emotion rather than feeling it. She'd marked him as gifted, possibly on the autism spectrum, a child who would do well academically but struggle socially. She'd been teaching long enough to recognize the type. What she'd also noticed, with the peculiar attention to detail that long experience brings, was that Peter Novak was absent on a very specific schedule. He'd missed September 8th, September 22nd, October 6th, and October 20th, all Thursdays, all with notes from his mother citing medical appointments. Margaret had flagged it in her gradebook not out of suspicion, but out of procedural habit. Excessive absences affected academic performance, and while Peter's grades remained perfect, the pattern bothered her sense of order. 4 absences in 8 weeks was borderline for requiring a parent conference. She'd made a note to discuss it with his mother at the upcoming parent-teacher conferences in November, but Peter wasn't the only student whose attendance had caught her attention. In her second-period class, a girl named Anna Rostov had been absent on September 15th, September 29th, October 13th, and October 27th, all Thursdays, all with similar medical appointment notes. Anna was different from Peter in every observable way. She was outgoing, popular, involved in student government and the drama club. Her family had emigrated from Poland in 1978, part of the small wave of refugees who'd left during the brief thaw before Solidarity was crushed. Anna's father worked as a mechanical engineer for a defense contractor in Crystal City. Her mother was a nurse at Arlington Hospital. They were model immigrants, grateful and industrious, exactly the kind of family that made Americans feel good about being Americans. Anna's absences were marked in Margaret's attendance book with the same clinical precision, but she'd thought nothing of connecting them to Peter Novak's. They were in different class periods, came from different backgrounds, ran in different social circles. There was no obvious reason to link them. The connection revealed itself by accident on November 14th, the same morning that would later be marked in classified documents as the beginning of what the FBI would codename Operation Threadbare. Margaret had arrived at school early that Thursday, as was her habit, to prepare for the day and enjoy the building's brief quietness before students arrived. She'd been updating her grade books, transferring attendance marks from her daily sheets to the permanent record when she'd laid out all 4 class rosters side by side to check for a clerical error. That's when the pattern emerged with sudden, unmistakable clarity. Peter Novak, Anna Rostov, and 3 other students across her 4 classes had all been absent on the same Thursdays, following a precise 14-day cycle. 5 students, 4 different class periods, all missing school on the same days with medical appointment excuses. The statistical improbability struck her immediately. She'd been teaching for 28 years and had never seen such a pattern. The other 3 students were David Chen, whose family had immigrated from Taiwan in 1980, Marcus Webb, a black student whose father was a sergeant at Fort Myer, and Jennifer Kozlov, whose parents had come from Czechoslovakia in 1975 after her father had defected following the Prague Springs final suppression. 5 students from 5 different backgrounds, connected by nothing visible except this strange rhythm of absence. Margaret sat at her desk as morning light filled the classroom and felt something cold move through her chest. It was probably nothing. Medical appointments could cluster for any number of innocent reasons. Shared doctors, insurance requirements, specialist availability. But the precision of it bothered her. 14 days exactly, every other Thursday, for 3 months. She spent her planning period that morning reviewing her attendance records going back to the start of the school year. The pattern held perfectly. She checked the notes from parents. They were all slightly different in wording but identical in excuse. Medical appointments, orthodontist visits, allergy treatments. She made photocopies of the relevant pages from her gradebook, though she couldn't have explained why. Some instinct from a lifetime of documentation told her to preserve the pattern. She placed the copies in a manila folder and locked it in her desk drawer. She taught her classes that day with half her attention on the lesson and half on the 5 empty desks scattered across her schedule. Peter Novak was absent again. So was Anna Rostov. So were the other 3. Thursday, November 14th, 1983. The pattern continued. That evening, Margaret sat in her apartment with the folder open on her kitchen table, a cup of tea going cold beside it. The radio was playing something classical she wasn't really hearing. She looked at the names and the dates and tried to convince herself she was seeing phantoms. Teachers developed strange fixations sometimes, pattern-seeking behavior born from managing large groups of children and looking for warning signs of trouble. She'd had colleagues who became convinced of conspiracies among students, elaborate cheating schemes or secret societies that turned out to be nothing more than coincidence and the paranoia of middle age. She was 52 years old and unmarried and lived alone. She knew the psychology of lonely people who found significance in meaningless patterns. She told herself this was that. But she couldn't make herself believe it. The next morning, Friday, November 15th, she did something she'd never done in 28 years of teaching. She went to the school office during her planning period and asked to see the enrollment files for the 5 students. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, was a woman who'd worked at Lincoln since it opened and guarded administrative records with territorial fierceness. Margaret had to invent a reason, something about coordinating a special project and needing to verify parent contact information. Mrs. Henderson had given her a skeptical look, but pulled the files. Margaret had spent 40 minutes in the administrative conference room reviewing them, taking notes in her careful handwriting. What she found made the cold feeling in her chest expand. All 5 students had enrolled at Lincoln within a 3-week period in August 1983, despite their records claiming they'd been at different previous schools. All 5 had parents who worked in jobs that required security clearances or proximity to classified work, though that wasn't unusual in Falls Church. What was unusual was that none of the previous schools listed in their records had sent transcript requests or made follow-up calls, which was standard procedure for student transfers. The paperwork was perfect, too perfect, as if someone had created it all at once rather than accumulated it over years of actual schooling. And all 5 families lived within a 2-mile radius of each other in Arlington, in different neighborhoods, but close enough that someone planning logistics might choose those locations for convenience. Margaret had returned the files to Mrs. Henderson and gone back to her classroom feeling like she was walking through a dream where everything looked normal, but nothing made sense. She taught her afternoon classes and drove home and sat in her apartment as darkness fell, trying to decide if she was losing her mind. She thought about calling someone but couldn't imagine explaining what she'd found without sounding paranoid. She thought about letting it go, dismissing it as coincidence and returning to her normal life of grading papers and listening to public radio alone. That would have been the sensible thing. That would have been what 99 out of 100 people would have done. But Margaret Holloway had spent her entire adult life believing that details mattered, that small things revealed large truths, that paying attention was a moral obligation. She'd built her teaching philosophy on that foundation. She couldn't abandon it now. On Monday, November 18th, she made a decision that would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. She called the FBI. It took her 3 tries to find the right number, working through the phone book until she reached the Washington field office. She asked to speak with someone about a potential security concern. She was transferred twice, put on hold for 15 minutes, and finally connected with a man who identified himself as Special Agent Robert Carver. She explained what she'd found, trying to keep her voice steady and professional, knowing how it sounded. A middle school teacher calling about an attendance pattern. She could hear the skepticism in Carver's polite responses. He took her information and told her someone might follow up. She could tell he was humoring her. She thanked him and hung up, feeling foolish and relieved in equal measure. She'd done her civic duty. Now she could let it go. But 3 days later, on Thursday, November 21st, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Lincoln Middle School during her planning period and asked to speak with her privately. They showed identification that looked more official than any ID she'd ever seen. FBI Counterintelligence Division. They asked her to show them everything she'd noticed. They asked questions for 2 hours, taking notes in small leather notebooks, their faces carefully neutral. They asked her not to discuss this with anyone, using language that wasn't quite a threat but carried weight nonetheless. National security implications, ongoing investigation, need-to-know basis. They thanked her and left, and Margaret sat in her empty classroom feeling like she'd opened a door she could never close. What Margaret Holloway didn't know, couldn't know, was that her phone call had landed on the desk of a counterintelligence unit that had been hunting shadows for 18 months. The FBI's Washington field office had been running a task force codenamed SEAV since March 1982, dedicated to identifying Soviet illegals operating in the capital region. They had suspicions, fragments of intercepted communications, patterns in diplomatic traffic that suggested a network existed, but nothing concrete. Intelligence work during the Cold War was archaeology in reverse, trying to reconstruct something that was actively being hidden rather than passively buried by time. You collected fragments, anomalies, things that didn't fit, and hoped eventually the pieces would form a picture. Margaret's call had provided a piece they hadn't known they were missing. Special Agent Robert Carver was 41 years old and had spent his entire career chasing people who didn't exist. He joined the FBI in 1968, right out of law school, motivated by a combination of patriotic idealism and the simple fact that his draft number had been low and the Bureau offered exemption from Vietnam. He'd started in bank robbery and organized crime, traditional criminal work with clear villains and clear evidence. But in 1975, he'd been transferred to counterintelligence after demonstrating an unusual patience for detail work and an ability to see patterns in financial records. He'd spent the last 8 years learning to think like people who lived lies so deep they sometimes forgot the truth themselves. Soviet illegals were different from spies in movies. They didn't seduce secrets from diplomats at cocktail parties or photograph documents in dark parking garages. They lived quiet lives, worked ordinary jobs, raised children in suburbs, and very occasionally, when activated, passed information so carefully that detection was nearly impossible. They were ghosts with driver's licenses and mortgages. When Margaret Holloway's call had come through, Carver had been reviewing financial records for a man named Thomas Peterson, who worked as a mid-level analyst at the Department of Energy. Peterson had no suspicious contacts, no unusual travel, no financial irregularities. But he'd appeared in Washington in 1978 with a perfectly constructed background that didn't quite hold up under deep investigation. His college transcripts were real, but the people who supposedly remembered him from Ohio State couldn't actually describe him when pressed. His work history checked out on paper, but fell apart in human memory. He was a plausible person who might not be a real one. The task force had been watching him for 11 months without learning anything useful. He went to work, came home, watched television, mowed his lawn. If he was a Soviet intelligence officer, he was dormant. Or he was very, very good. Carver had listened to Margaret's explanation with the weary skepticism of someone who received 3 conspiracy calls a week, most from people who'd watched too many spy movies or were genuinely mentally ill. But something in her voice had registered differently. She wasn't excited or paranoid. She was uncertain, almost embarrassed, presenting her findings like a student who wasn't sure she'd done the math correctly, but knew she should show her work. She'd noticed a pattern and thought someone should know. That kind of reluctant reporting was rare and, in Carver's experience, often significant. He'd taken detailed notes and told her he'd look into it, expecting to find nothing. But when he'd run the names through the FBI's database, something had made his chest tighten. Jennifer Kozlov's father, Anton Kozlov, had been flagged in a 1979 CIA memo as a possible agent of interest who'd defected under circumstances that had never quite been explained. He'd been a minor engineer in Czechoslovakia, hardly important enough to warrant the elaborate extraction the CIA had supposedly arranged. The file had been stamped with notations suggesting follow-up investigation, but those had apparently never been completed. Budget cuts, personnel changes, the bureaucratic entropy that let things fall through cracks. Anna Rostov's father, Dmitry Rostov, worked for a defense contractor with Pentagon clearance, but his employment history before 1978 contained the same kind of too-perfect documentation that Thomas Peterson's had. David Chen's family background checked out, but his father's import-export business had financial patterns that suggested money laundering, though nothing had ever been proven. Marcus Webb's father was exactly what he claimed to be, a career Army sergeant, no flags at all. And Peter Novak's family was almost invisible, their background so generic it read like a template. Carver had spent 3 days pulling records, making calls to field offices in Pennsylvania and Ohio, checking immigration files and school transfer documentation. The pattern Margaret had found in attendance records was replicated in everything else. These 5 families had all appeared in the Washington area within weeks of each other in the summer of 1983, all with backgrounds that were plausible but thin, all connected to nothing except their physical proximity and their children's synchronized absences from school. Individually, each family could be explained. Collectively, they formed something that looked very much like a network. The surveillance had begun on November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving. 8 FBI agents working in rotating shifts, watching the 5 families with the careful patience that counterintelligence required. They photographed people coming and going from houses, noted the times cars left driveways, documented shopping trips and errand runs. They recorded license plates and ran them through databases. They used telephoto lenses and directional microphones and all the tools of a surveillance state that operated in the gray zones where civil liberties met national security. What they found was exactly what Margaret had found: a pattern. Every other Thursday, the 5 families followed identical routines. The children stayed home from school. The mothers took them in cars at staggered times, driving to different locations in Arlington and Alexandria, apparently running separate errands. But when the surveillance teams tracked the routes carefully, they discovered that all 5 mothers, at some point during those Thursdays, passed through the same parking lot at Ballston Common Mall. They didn't park. They didn't stop. They simply drove through, sometimes within minutes of each other, sometimes with hours between passes. And on those same Thursdays, a man driving a brown Chevrolet Malibu with Maryland plates also drove through that parking lot, usually around midday, usually staying less than 5 minutes. The man in the Malibu was Thomas Peterson, the Department of Energy analyst the task force had been watching for 11 months. The connection was invisible unless you were looking for it. A brief intersection in a public space that could be coincidence or could be a brush pass, the tradecraft technique where intelligence officers exchange materials or signals without ever appearing to make contact. You drove past someone, they dropped something, you picked it up. Or you both parked, walked past each other, made the exchange in motion. It took seconds and left no evidence unless someone was watching very carefully. Carver had requested authorization for more aggressive surveillance, wiretaps, mail intercepts, trash pulls. The kind of investigation that required warrants and judicial approval, but also the kind that sometimes revealed nothing because the people being watched were trained to detect it. Soviet illegals lived under the assumption they were always being watched. They built their lives to withstand scrutiny. But they also had to communicate, had to receive instructions, had to justify their existence to handlers in Moscow who measured productivity in intelligence gathered and operations completed. Somewhere in their carefully constructed normal lives, there had to be a crack. The crack appeared on December 8, 1983. One of the surveillance teams photographed Thomas Peterson entering a library in McLean, carrying a briefcase, and leaving 20 minutes later without it. 30 minutes after Peterson left, Anton Kozlov, Jennifer's father, entered the same library carrying a shopping bag and left with both the bag and a briefcase that looked identical to Peterson's. The exchange had been so clean, it would have been invisible except for the agents watching both men simultaneously. The briefcase was the evidence they'd been hunting for 18 months. The FBI moved carefully. They didn't arrest anyone. Instead, they obtained a warrant to enter Kozlov's house when the family was away and examine the briefcase's contents. What they found were documents that shouldn't exist outside secured facilities. Technical specifications for missile guidance systems, stolen from the Department of Energy through Peterson's access, copying them, removing them, passing them to Kozlov, who presumably passed them further up a chain that led eventually to Moscow. The network Margaret had accidentally discovered wasn't just cover identities living quiet lives. It was an active espionage operation. The decision to roll up the network came from Washington, from people whose names Carver never learned. On December 15, 1983, FBI agents arrested Thomas Peterson, Anton Kozlov, Dmitry Rostov, and Peter Novak's father, whose real name turned out to be Pyotr Sokolov. David Chen's father was also detained, though he was released after 72 hours when it became clear he was exactly what he claimed to be, an immigrant businessman who'd been used without his knowledge. The arrests were coordinated, simultaneous, designed to prevent anyone from warning anyone else. By evening, 4 Soviet intelligence officers were in federal custody, and a network that had been operating for at least 5 years had been destroyed. Margaret Holloway learned about the arrests from the evening news like everyone else. She sat in her apartment watching a reporter stand outside the FBI building and explain that a major espionage operation had been disrupted, that foreign agents had been stealing defense secrets, that the investigation was ongoing. They didn't mention her. They didn't mention Lincoln Middle School or attendance sheets or the strange pattern that had started everything. She watched until the news moved on to other stories, then turned off the television and sat in silence, trying to process what her simple observation had set in motion. 2 days later, Robert Carver came to her apartment. He arrived in the evening, dressed in civilian clothes, looking tired in a way that suggested he hadn't slept properly in weeks. He thanked her formally, told her that she couldn't discuss what had happened, that her role would remain classified for reasons of national security and her own protection. He explained that the Soviet intelligence service would eventually learn how their network had been discovered, and if they knew a schoolteacher had identified the pattern, she might become a target for retaliation or propaganda. It was better for everyone if she simply returned to her normal life and forgot this had happened. Margaret had asked him one question. Had children really been used as part of the espionage operation? Carver had hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. The children had been brought to America to make the families look authentic, he'd said. They'd attended school, made friends, lived apparently normal lives while their parents stole secrets that could impact weapon systems and nuclear defense. The Thursday absences had been for language training and ideological education, sessions held at a safe house in Arlington where the children were reminded of their real identities and their duty to the Soviet state. They were being raised as the next generation of illegals, children who would grow up completely American on the surface but loyal to Moscow underneath. It was a long-term investment in espionage infrastructure. The children themselves were probably victims as much as tools, though that distinction mattered little in the machinery of intelligence work. She'd asked what would happen to them. Carver had told her that the adults would be prosecuted or exchanged in prisoner swaps, sent back to Moscow to face whatever judgment the KGB rendered on failed operations. The children would be placed in foster care or returned to the Soviet Union depending on their ages and the diplomatic negotiations that followed. Their lives in America were over. Everything they'd known was a lie constructed for purposes they'd been too young to understand. They would grow up knowing they'd been used, that their childhoods had been weapons, that even their friendships and memories were contaminated by espionage. Margaret had felt something break in her chest when he'd explained this, a grief for children she barely knew who'd been destroyed by decisions made in offices she couldn't imagine. After Carver left, Margaret had sat at her kitchen table for a long time, looking at the folder she'd created with its photocopied attendance records and notes. The evidence of a pattern that had seemed so insignificant when she'd first noticed it. She'd been a teacher for 28 years, dedicated to the belief that education mattered, that helping children understand the world made that world better. But what she'd discovered was that children could be weapons, that families could be weapons, that normal life itself could be weaponized in the service of ideologies and power struggles that treated human beings as disposable pieces in games played by people who never saw the consequences of their decisions. She thought about Peter Novak sitting in the back of her classroom, taking notes with mechanical precision, never quite connecting with the other students. She'd thought he was gifted, possibly autistic, a child who needed patience and understanding. Now she knew he'd been something else entirely. A boy being trained to live a lie so deep he might never find his way back to any authentic self. She thought about Anna Rostov, outgoing and popular, involved in student government and drama club, apparently thriving. All of it performance, learned behavior, a cover identity being perfected. She thought about the Thursday absences and the pattern she'd noticed, and the simple act of paying attention that had unraveled lives. The school year continued. The 5 students never returned to Lincoln Middle School. Their desks were quietly reassigned to new students who transferred in after Christmas break. Margaret never spoke about what had happened, not to colleagues, not to friends, not to anyone. She taught her classes and graded her papers and lived her quiet life, but something had changed in how she experienced the world. She'd learned that the Cold War wasn't something that happened in Berlin or Moscow, or distant places she'd never visit. It happened in suburbs and shopping malls and middle school classrooms. It happened in attendance sheets and parent-teacher conferences and the small details of ordinary life that could reveal extraordinary secrets if you paid enough attention. In February 1984, she received a letter on FBI stationery thanking her for her service to national security. It was formal and impersonal, the kind of letter that could mean anything or nothing, signed by someone whose title was redacted. She filed it away and never looked at it again. In March, she noticed that her phone had a strange echo on certain calls, a hollow quality that suggested someone might be listening. It disappeared after a few weeks. She never knew if it had been real or imagined. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed into history, Margaret would sometimes think about those 5 families and wonder what had become of them. She'd read about prisoner exchanges and defectors and the complicated process of people trying to rebuild lives after their previous identities had been exposed as constructions. She'd wonder if Peter Novak was somewhere thinking about the 7th grade history class where he'd sat in the back taking perfect notes, if any of those children remembered Falls Church and Lincoln Middle School and the brief moment when they'd almost been American before the machinery of espionage had ground their lives into something else. She retired from teaching in 1995 after 40 years in classrooms that had changed around her in ways both small and profound. The Cold War was over, but the world hadn't become simpler or safer, just differently complicated. She moved to a small house in Fredericksburg, planted a garden, volunteered at the local library. She lived quietly until 2003, when she died of a stroke at 72, alone in her home, found 2 days later by a neighbor who'd noticed her mail piling up. In the obituary published in the Fredericksburg Free-Lance Star, she was remembered as a dedicated educator who'd touched countless lives, a woman who'd believed in the importance of details and the power of paying attention. There was no mention of espionage or FBI investigations or the pattern she'd discovered in an attendance sheet. That part of her life remained classified, locked in files that might be opened decades later or might be destroyed unread, another secret lost in the vast archive of Cold War intelligence operations. But somewhere in a vault in Langley, Virginia, there's a folder marked with a case number and classification stamps, containing photocopied pages from a 7th grade teacher's attendance records. The pattern is still visible in those pages, the carefully marked absences that revealed a network, the simple act of documentation that became evidence. It's a small thing, unremarkable unless you know what it means. Like most of the Cold War's truths, it hides in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. The 5 families that Margaret Holloway had identified became footnotes in the larger history of Soviet espionage in America, minor players in operations that continued until the Soviet state itself ceased to exist. The children grew up scattered across continents, carrying names that weren't the ones they'd been born with, trying to build authentic lives on foundations of constructed identity. Some succeeded. Others spent decades in therapy, trying to untangle who they really were from who they'd been trained to be. None of them ever knew that a middle school teacher with a simple attendance sheet had been the beginning of their undoing. Margaret never considered herself a hero. She'd done what teachers do, paid attention, noticed patterns, documented what she saw. She'd believed that details mattered, and that small truths could reveal larger ones. In the end, that belief had been proven correct in ways she'd never wanted. The pattern she'd found had been real, but the cost of that reality was measured in broken families and traumatized children and lives destroyed by the collision between ordinary existence and the machinery of state power. If stories like this make you understand how the Cold War was fought in attendance records and parking lots rather than battlefields, if they help you see that ordinary people became part of extraordinary machinery simply by being observant, then perhaps they're worth remembering. The truth of that era wasn't just in the dramatic moments history records, but in the quiet intersections where normal life became evidence, where paying attention became a form of warfare, and where a teacher doing her job accidentally mapped a network of shadows. The Cold War ended not with nuclear fire but with the slow collapse of systems that couldn't sustain the weight of their own contradictions. But while it lasted, it turned everyone into potential participants in a conflict they didn't choose and often didn't understand. Margaret Holloway was one of millions who lived through that strange time when the world was divided into opposed certainties and the space between them was filled with people trying to survive. Her story is small and easily forgotten, but it's also true in the way that matters most. It shows how history happens in details, in patterns noticed by people who simply refuse to look away. The attendance sheet that started everything was eventually declassified in 2008 as part of a routine document release. By then, most of the people it had affected were dead or scattered beyond finding. The pattern Margaret had noticed was still visible in those yellowed pages, marked in her careful handwriting with dates and names that had once been secrets and were now just historical curiosities. Someone researching Cold War espionage might find it in an archive someday and wonder about the teacher who'd created it, about what she'd thought when she'd first seen the pattern, about whether she'd understood what she was uncovering. But most likely, it will remain unexamined, one more document among millions, evidence of a war fought in shadows and silence, preserved in the hope that future generations might learn something from the careful record of how easily normal life could become something else entirely.